That song sounded familiar, the words probably didn't. That was Apologetics. I have a link on the bulletin if you want to check that out again. Typically when I find music like this, I listen to it over and over and over again as I'm preparing sermons, as I'm contemplating direction. It really can be inspiring, and I don't know, maybe some of you don't feel that kind of inspiration from music, but we're going to be getting into some music over the next 12 or 13 weeks or so. The new sermon series title, if you have a bulletin, is More Than Words. And I'm going to be using some secular, some Christian music each week to highlight the purpose for that week and what we're going to be talking about. As we consider this week after Christ died, was rose from the dead, we know that Thomas, it wasn't until this morning, a week later, that he saw the risen Christ. But there was still some hesitation, there was still some fear in the disciples. Even after they had encountered the risen Savior the week before, Easter afternoon, he came to them and said, "Go into Galilee." And there he would meet them, he was going to teach them some things, and we know that after 40 days he was going to ascend into heaven. So why are the disciples still sitting in that upper room a week later? Thomas didn't have that much sway over the group. I mean, it was Thomas that evening he came back into the room and they said, "We saw Jesus," and he said, I won't believe it. I can't believe it unless I see the scars. But it wasn't just Thomas's hesitation that kept all of them there. Why didn't they leave that night? Even without Thomas having seen Christ, they could have said, "Look, we saw him. You'll see him when we get there. Let's go." But a week later, they're in the same place. And so for the next 3 weeks, I want us to remember some things. Some things that I'm thinking as they're going through that initial couple of days of Jesus' death and before he was resurrected, maybe even in this week following, some things are starting to occur to the disciples. The first thing I want us to remember is something Jesus said, "Night is coming." From John 9. If you don't recall exactly what's in John chapter 9, you'll recall the story when I start to share it. This was about the man that was born blind. Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple, and they're passing by a blind beggar. And that was not unusual because Jesus would walk by many, even healing several beggars. And we see that in the scriptures, in the Gospels. But there's something unusual about this particular passing. They knew this man. And the disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" You see, they're walking by a beggar who happens to be blind, and without any instruction, without any foreknowledge, they knew he was born that way. Which means that they had seen this person before. They recognized this particular beggar, this blind man. He was well established in the community. He sat near the temple asking for handouts, asking for money because he was blind, he couldn't work, so that's how he would live. And everyone who went in and out of the temple would see him, would know who he was. What's also unusual is this is the first time that we see the disciples questioning why somebody is sick. Why is somebody blind? And they look at Jesus and they say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Why would God allow him to be born this way?" Maybe they understood some science, some idea that as you get older, your eyesight might go, or you might have an accident that blinds you, and so there are blind people that have to beg for food and alms. But they stop and they say, why was it that God allowed this person to be born that way? Was it because of his sin? God knew what he was going to become? Or was it his parents' sin? And Jesus said it wasn't that this man sinned or his parents, but that the work of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And I have to think that when the disciples are sitting there in the upper room, Jesus dead, this may have been the first thing that they remembered. As night was falling. Jesus said, as long as I'm here, I'm the light of the world. And now he's gone. The man wasn't born blind because of any sin. It was to demonstrate God's might, his power. And Jesus said something that must have been odd to them at the time. He said, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. I have a hard time believing that he was talking about physical nighttime. Because even then, when they had no electricity, there were certainly candles. There were certainly people who did things in the middle of the night. We know that they tried Jesus in the middle of the night. People are working. And the Bible was written for all time, so God must have clearly known we would have third shifts and second shifts at jobs. There are companies that don't ever close. Of course people can work at night. So even though they wouldn't have worked as much as we do today at night, they may have also been a little curious as to what he meant by that. Until he died. And night had come. And the light had gone out of the world. Until he shows up and tells them something else. Reminds them of what he had already been teaching them. That we are the light of the world. And while Jesus was here, he was the brightest shining light. The Bible says that we are the light that he's left in this world. So there's something very important going on in that one statement. But I want to go through the story of chapter 9 of healing this blind man, because then maybe it will become more clear. So they're walking by a blind man, and they say, well, what sin caused him to be born blind? And Jesus said, it wasn't sin. It was so that God could demonstrate his power. While it's still daytime, we have to do the work that God has sent me to do, because night's coming. And so he spits on the ground. And he bends down, and he just smears the mud in this man's eyes. I'm thinking that's where the phrase, here's mud in your eye, comes from. Maybe I'm wrong, but that would put a better positive slant on that phrase, wouldn't it? But this blind guy's just sitting there looking for money. And these people come up and say, is this guy a sinner or what? I mean, this is what he's hearing. Close your eyes. He's hearing this. These people are walking by, and he's like, is this guy an awful, terrible sinner, or was it his parents? And then another voice says, it wasn't for sin, it was for God. And then he rubs mud in my eyes. And then, right after he rubs mud in this guy's eyes, he said, now go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And what's more amazing than that is the man just got up and went and washed his eyes. He didn't even argue. How many of you, if you were sitting there blind asking for stuff, one day people walk up to you and said, look at how awful rotten sinner that guy is. Or maybe his parents are just the worst. And then they throw mud in your face. Would you be in a good mood at that point or a bad mood? But he got up and he went. And when he came back, he could see. It's interesting, people saw this blind man coming back to where he normally sat, and he's looking around, and people started getting all confused, because a lot of these people, like I said, they knew him. They recognized him, and some people said, no, that can't be him. There's somebody who looks just like that blind guy. Come here and look at this. He looks just like that blind guy. And he says, and then the guy that was blind walks up, he says, I'm the man. He probably didn't say it just like that. He said, I'm that man. I'm the blind guy, but I'm not blind anymore. And they said, how on earth could that possibly have happened? And he said, the man called Jesus. He put mud on my eyes and he said, go wash it off. And when I did, I could see. And then they asked, where's Jesus? The man said, I don't know, I didn't see him. And so they said, well, you got to come with us. There's something very strange going on here. And they take him in to see the Pharisees and the leaders in the Sanhedrin. And some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how could this man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them, among the leaders, saying, who is this Jesus? He just broke the Sabbath. But he gave sight to a blind man, not just who was blind, but who was born that way. His eyes never worked. And so because these leaders who were educated and schooled in the Scriptures couldn't figure it out, they looked at the beggar and said, what do you think? What do you think about this guy? What an odd scene. People who should have known better are dumbfounded and say to somebody who wouldn't have a clue, what do you think of this guy who did this to you? And the blind guy just said, he's a prophet. And then the Jews started to question whether this was a guy born blind. And they asked to have his parents brought before them to confirm his identity. What does this tell you? What does it tell you that the Pharisees had to bring the parents to confirm his identity? When the disciples knew it, all the people knew it. These Pharisees had ignored him every time they go in and out of the temple. Completely overlooked him because he's a blind sinner. We don't associate with those people. We take the other door. I don't know who this guy is. The people brought him before the Pharisees and said he was blind. And they're arguing. They're like, no, that can't be. Jesus couldn't have done that. He can't be from God. He broke the Sabbath. And then they said, no, you guys are lying. This isn't any blind guy. He can see, obviously. Where's his parents? We need identification. They didn't know who he was. And when his parents came, they were afraid to testify because they would have been judged with him. Because the Pharisees, the rulers, had said anyone who puts their trust in Jesus is no longer welcome in the temple. They will be put out of the synagogue. You cannot worship in Jewish holy places if you believe that Jesus is from God. Just as a little side note, it's very sad that we have so many denominations in our world today that act just like that. And it's changing. I don't want to get you down because it is changing. I know people in every denomination that would throw that attitude out the window. But there was a time, not too long ago, and there are still some carryover churches that will say, if you don't go to our church, if you don't believe the way our denomination does, you can't be saved. There's no way. You can't be saved because you don't get it. You're not following Jesus. That's the way the Pharisees thought. I wouldn't think any Christian church would want to lump themselves with that. But the parents were afraid of him. And so they simply said, yes, this is our son. He was blind from birth. We have no idea how he got his sight. He's old enough, why don't you ask him? And so they asked him again. They looked back at the blind guy and said, okay, from the top, tell us, how is it that you can see right now? And he just says, I already told you. And you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Talk about boldness. These people were the leaders. They were in power. And they said, tell us the truth. You were probably lying before. Jesus didn't do this. How did you receive your sight? He said, I told you. You didn't believe it. Are you asking again because you want to follow him? And that really ticked him off. Did not go over well. They said, we're Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this man, we don't even know where he's from. And the blind guy just said, well, that's funny. That's funny to hear leaders educated in the Scriptures telling me that something only God can do couldn't have been done by God. That's just simple logic. If only God can do something, then it doesn't matter if you don't know where he's from. If only God can do it, then he's from God. Whatever else you can say about him, that's the only answer to this problem. You want to know how I can see? He did it. And if only God can do something like that, I'm only left with one conclusion. And then they got all mad at him for trying to educate them. They said, you were born and raised in sin. You have no right to tell us what's true, what's not true, what's from God. And so they threw him out of the synagogue. I'm thinking he wasn't all that upset about it. And I don't know how many of you guys have left a church that just wasn't working. I hope not very many of us, because it's sad when that happens. But when you leave a church that's just completely off the rocker, you don't leave thinking you're abandoning God. You leave with a heavy heart thinking all of those people have missed the boat. Something's not right. So when these leaders who, I'm sure this blind guy, like every other Jew of his day, trusted, believed that they knew what they were doing, they were in charge, they were studied, they knew what the Bible said, they were looking for the Messiah too. And he just lost all confidence in them because they refused to see what was right in front of their face. So he's walking. Jesus heard that he was cast out, and he went and found him. And this guy wouldn't have known Jesus, because until he starts talking to him, he wouldn't even recognize the voice. He didn't see him before. So he just walks up to him and he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he said, who is the Son of Man? So that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you've seen him. It's the one talking to you right now. And he said, Lord, I believe and worship him. The man probably fell down to his knees and worshiped him. He knew he was from God. And then another strange thing happens, another strange comment, which is going to tie back in the beginning. Jesus says, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And some of the Pharisees were near and heard these things, and they said, what, are we blind? And Jesus just looked at them and said, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But because you say that you can see, your guilt remains. Because you should know better. And you can see. And you've ignored it. You've rejected it. So do you see what's going on here? I did write a little bit of a study guide in the bulletin today. If anybody wants to go through it, although I'm going to be hitting on some of the answers right now. Because Jesus began by saying that this man was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. It says might. He didn't say so that the works of God would be displayed in him. What are the works of God? It's not bringing sight back to a blind man. There will always be poor, there will always be crippled, there will always be people with infirmities on this planet. It's a part of our world. Healing his blindness was not a work of God. It was a miracle, right? It testified to the fact that Jesus came from God, that only God could do something like that because no one had ever heard before of a man being born blind and receiving his sight. Now, science today may be able to fix some of that. We figured out how the eyeball works. We can replace eyes for people born blind. You can't heal an eye that's been dead since it was created. So it lended itself to the identity of Christ. But what is the work of him who sent me? Well, he says, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. So then clearly he's not talking about your eyes. The work of God is to save people. It has nothing to do with your body or any part of your physical being. The work of God was Christ came to deliver us from death. We start off dead, and he brings us to life. And what he's saying here is, I've come so that people who can't see can see that. And the work of God that happened to this blind man was not him receiving his sight. It was him being saved, being forgiven. And when that moment happened was when he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he said, I can, I will, if you tell me who he is. And Jesus says, I am. And he worshiped him. There was faith. There was belief. That was the work of God. And Jesus didn't say he was born blind so that God's work would be done. He said, so it might be done. Because until that man came to that decision, until he chose to worship Christ as a result of what Jesus was doing for him and talking to him about, the work wasn't done yet. And how many people do we know that given this same opportunity, given that same explanation, this is who Jesus is, this is what he came for, this is what he did for you, and they just throw it off? What silly nonsense. But then Jesus also made another comment here, a statement at the beginning. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. And I mentioned that as the disciples may have been remembering this, that they go back to that time and think, Jesus said, while I'm here, I'm the light of the world, and now what? So I pose the question to you, is the light gone from the world? Jesus is no longer here. His Spirit lives in us, but he's not in the world. We are. So are we living in darkness? Are we living in the night? The answer to that is no. Because elsewhere, Jesus also said, you are the light of the world. What Jesus was saying at the very beginning of this, when the disciples misunderstood the whole situation, and they said, was he born blind because he's sinful or his parents are sinful? And Jesus said, no, you don't understand. God's power might be made manifest in him. And we need to be doing that while it's still day. Because night is coming. The night that Jesus was referring to was not nighttime. The night that Jesus was referring to was the end of the world. A time is coming when no one will be able to ever see again. There are people on this planet right now whose eyes may still be open. But when Christ returns, or when death finds us individually, your eyes, if they're shut, will remain so forever. Because when night falls on us, no one can live. And so I come back to the end. Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. The work of God is to bring light to people, to show them themselves, to show them the reality of the world around them that most people are completely blinded to show them that there's something wrong with them, and that all they need to do is turn to Christ for forgiveness, and they will be healed, they will be saved. And some people who have never seen that, never heard that, who have been blind, he opens their eyes, and then we're allowed to respond. And other people who walk through this life thinking their eyes are wide open, they know everything, evolution and science have all the answers. There is no God. What that light's going to do is bring to their attention the reality that they've ignored. And they will continue to ignore it, and they will be guilty, and they will die. One thing that we need to always be doing is praying for those people. Because while they still live, there's still at least a chance that they can change their mind. You know, part of what I do in sermon preparation, almost on a weekly basis, is I'll go on the internet and I'll look at people like Dawkins and Bill Nye, Bill Maher, all these people who hate God, all these people that spend half their time, if not more, putting out videos and putting out media to say how delusional this concept of God is and how science has figured everything else out. And I watch that and I listen to what they're saying and I hear how twisted their logic really is. Because somebody that can't see doesn't know that they're blind. They don't know that what they're saying contradicts God. And so as I'm studying that, and I get a little depressed at how many people in this world listen to that. And I pray for them because they're still capable of coming to faith. I have to believe. Maybe some of them have already gone too far. But I put myself in that position because it breaks my heart. And if we don't live with hearts broken for people that don't know Christ, then there's no reason for us to be on this planet. If we don't live every day looking for some way to introduce somebody we know to Christ, then we're wasting the time Christ has given to us. But I wanted to make something clear. This ties back into the video, don't fear the people. That's why most of us don't share the gospel. That's why most of us don't talk about our faith. We're afraid. And we're not afraid someone's going to kill us in America. We're afraid someone's going to laugh at us. We're afraid somebody's going to just stop being our friend. We're afraid someone's going to make some nasty comment and we won't know how to respond. And some of us, I'm afraid, fear that if they talk to somebody who has a good argument, they'll stop believing. Because some Christians' faith is just that weak. We don't want to hear what the other people say because they might be right. Any believer who believes that doesn't know God. Well, listen to what Jesus said. For judgment I came into this world. He didn't come to judge. Right? Over and over again he said, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to save you. Why would he say this? For judgment I came into the world. Did he come so that he could say people that haven't known any better, their eyes will be open, they'll get saved, and I'm going to point out to all you how wrong you are so that you won't be saved? Is that a judgment? That's not what he was doing. Who was doing the judging in chapter 9 of John? The Pharisees. For judgment I came into this world, and I want you to see this because I only saw this way recently. Jesus came into the world to be judged. He came into the world to take out all of our sins and have God judge him for it. What Jesus did on the cross was bore all of our sins. He bore all of our guilt. He bore all of that judgment and that wrath of God so that we don't have to. For judgment he came into this world so that by doing that people would see. They would see the light and they would either run to it and fall on their knees or they would run from it and reject it. And that's what these two groups of people will do. That's what all of us fit into one of those two groups. Jesus came to be judged. And he's saying to us, we need to continue in the work of God. Which means what? We will be judged. Not everybody's going to reject Christ, and so we'll all have some very powerful testimonies, some very powerful moments and conversations. But you won't ever have those if you're afraid to be judged. You won't ever find those converts if you're afraid to talk to anybody. Because most people will reject that message. That's just a fact. I don't want that to be true. I don't believe that that's true for any particular individual I want to talk to. I don't believe that any person that I'm going to share Christ with is going to flat out reject him, or else I won't even talk to him. I want to believe that everyone has the opportunity, but the Bible says very clearly most people will reject it and will persecute you for even bringing it up. We just have to know that that's the reality. Or the first time you try to talk to somebody and they come out against you, they just get all angry, you'll never try to talk to anybody again, because that doesn't feel good. What I'm trying to say this morning is that each of us has a job to do. And I don't know if the disciples remembered this that night, or weeks later, or a month later, but they went back to this, and they remembered Jesus said, we have to be doing the work that God sent me to do. While I'm here, I'm the light of the world. When I leave, you're the light of the world. And that's why they kept talking about Jesus all over the place. They got dragged before the Sanhedrin, and they said, stop! And Peter said, you have to judge for yourself whether it's right for us to listen to you or to listen to God, but we can't help but to speak about what we've seen and heard. This is real. You can kill us, but short of that, you can't shut us up. And I've mentioned that before, when I finally came to realize what God was, who he was, and what he did for me. When I started studying the Bible on my own when I was in college, I started talking to everybody who would listen. And I had people at my job saying, you can't talk about religion while you're working. And I said, sure I can. And they said, you could get fired. And I said, well, that could happen too. You can't stop me. Only I can do that. If I let myself be afraid of you. If I let myself be afraid of what the world thinks about me, some fanatic. Someone once said, and I don't know where I heard this, but I wrote it down because it was a very powerful statement. When your heart's in it, no one else ever needs to motivate you. When your heart is in something, you never need motivation. How many of you ever done something that was work? It was hard even. But you just wouldn't stop till it was done. And it didn't matter if you were getting paid for it or not. It's something that you felt strongly about and had to get done, and so you were going to finish it. That's what we're called to have with Christ. If your heart is in it, I don't have to stand up here every week and motivate you to talk to people or to invite people to church. You'll just start doing it. And so that's what I'm trying to convey. I'm trying to inspire that hardness, that putting your whole heart into it. Recognizing what Jesus did for you and then giving him everything back. Remember, night is coming. It's a sad reality that people will go down with this ship. But no single person has to. Not if we're still here. So I want to close this morning sharing with you a little bit about what the conference leadership had said when they came out here. About a month or two ago, leadership and some of the revitalization team members filled out some questionnaires, some surveys to show them where we've come in the last year. Because if you all remember, about a year ago in January 2014, we had a visit. And they said, your church is in crisis. You're declining, you're dying. And we said, we're not dying. Turns out we were. Just didn't feel like death because we were all still healthy. But did you know people can die like that in perfect health? That's what occurred to me after this last year. We could very well have been dying. They showed us something. I like to look at it like this. Pastor White showed it to us like this, and with the words are upside down. This is the attendance at this church since 1982 or so. It looks like that. We have gone on a decline from the middle 80s ever since. Now, I didn't feel like our church was dying. We're growing spiritually. We're learning about faith. I think all of us are much more faithful individually than we were when I first got here, even. I think we've been growing. But as a church, that's the picture we see for 30 years. And so they came and they visited us and they said, you're in trouble. And we have to decide whether the church is viable. Do you stay open or not? Can you afford to pay your bills? Because at that point we weren't even paying all of our conference share. And there were some reasons intentionally why we didn't pay part of it because of our financial situation first, but secondly what that part went to and how it really, I still see it as an unfair distribution for the different churches having to pay it. But that's what they said. They came in and they said, if the church is going to continue to exist, you need to pay all your bills. And you need to turn this church around. And it's not about worship. It's not about, the spiritual health of any one of us here. Because when the superintendent came and visited the Christmas before in 2013, and I had a meeting with him personally, he said to me, you have everything going on right at that church, but there's nobody there to see it. We do worship well. God is leading us, right? You can feel it. But he said there's just nobody there to hear it, to be convinced, to be changed. Our mission as a church is to change people's lives. If it's only the same 20 of us every week, we're not changing anybody's lives. We're already saved. And so that's what they came to us with. And then a year later, they came back. We filled out these surveys about what we've done. And most of you know that from that point, from April of 2014, we had a team of 7 people meeting every week. And we did 3 or 4 or 5 different events last year to try to make the neighborhood aware of who we are and where we are. We're trying to get visibility. And we worked on the purpose, this rise, that we're a church on the rise, reaching, inspiring, serving, and equipping. And I want you all to know that. Memorize that. That's who we are. And that's what we want to make a focus of what everything that we do needs to come from that perspective. And we started to develop all of that, and then we took these surveys, and then they came back to us with the results of all of our surveys together and said it doesn't look good. And the reason it didn't look good is because they didn't equate activity with fulfilling the mission of the church. And I do understand a part of that, because I think we had one person reported as being saved in that time. And so the market for missions, the movie nights outside, and all the other things that we've been doing haven't brought anyone to Christ yet. But what we said to them in this meeting was all of that was intentional. We are doing this on purpose to let the community know who we are. We need to first have people aware of us. The next step is to intentionally try to find people where they are and to share Christ with them. To see people come to Christ and come to faith. And as we're doing that, we do need the superintendent and the couple from the board that came out here, after hearing what we were saying, and they said that what we were saying and what we've been doing, what this church has been about for the last year, in words, painted a totally different picture than the surveys we filled out to them. And that's why, as Ashley said, they're going back to the leadership and saying, it's not done yet. The church has made some significant strides. But, and one of the things I want to mention, we are one of 13 churches in our conference of 36 or 38 that reported an increase in attendance last year. So we are doing something, but an increase of 2 from the prior year is not growth. But then I said to him, we went from 2 more last year to about 6 more so far this year. I mean, there is something going on here where we're seeing it, we're feeling it. But we're not out of the woods. And they wanted to make clear, he said they were encouraged by what's going on here. But they don't want to give us a false sense of hope. Because at any moment it can still crumble if we stop trying. If it becomes less urgent. if we're not trying to do the mission of the church, then we will still die. Every church dies that doesn't fulfill the mission. And that mission is to see people saved. And that's what this sermon this morning is all about. The night is coming. We need to do something before the night comes. We need to draw people to Christ before it's nighttime. And we are the light. We are now the light of the world. And with Christ in us, guiding us, we can make a difference. We can change the culture around us. But it's slow and it's a lot of work. And that's why we're asking that everybody put on the calendar to be a part of our confirmations this year. And that everybody find ways to be involved in one thing or another, be it sign-ups, and a lot of you guys are. And one of the things that we are encouraged by is almost every adult in this church is involved in some area or another. There's nobody that just comes to church and goes home. A couple of specific goals that we're looking at. We're going to be talking more in leadership on Monday. But we'd like to see 50 in attendance by the end of the year. And the only way that doesn't happen is if we don't try. Because every one of us knows somebody that we would like to see saved. Every one. And you may have to ask them to come to church with you every week until December before they accept an invitation. But we need to be about the work that Christ was sent here for. We have to have a specific target. And when I was talking to the superintendent about this, our target is primarily this neighborhood. There's only less than a handful. I mean, you can probably count on one hand, or maybe now two. The people that actually come to this church that can walk here if they needed to. We're kind of a commuter church. People drive from quite a distance in a lot of directions. And so one of the things we want to try to make our focus is how can we influence our neighborhood so the people that live next door are comfortable coming in here and worshiping with us on a Sunday. And sometimes some of that's going to require some of us who live farther away spending some time coming in and walking around the neighborhood and getting to know people, even though we have to drive out of our way to get here and do that. But the last thing that I want to leave us with this morning is that we have to maintain a sense of urgency. Very often I preach about how important it is to reach people. Sometimes I don't know if that urgency is just mine or if it is transferring to all of you. But we need to maintain that. Jesus wasn't kidding when he said, "Night's coming." The Bible is not kidding when it says today is the appointed time. Today is the day of salvation. You don't know if you have tomorrow. None of us do. None of them do. What happens when they don't have it tomorrow and we were going to wait until the next day to talk to them? So my prayer is that in all this excitement, and I am excited about what this church is doing, in all of the excitement of just coming off the resurrection of Christ, the joy and the hope that he brings to the world would fill our hearts, and that we would be overwhelmed looking for ways to talk to somebody, to drag people to join us for church. Even if you have to say, "I'll take you to lunch after." I just want you to hear something. I want you to see something that God's doing. And then it's up to them. It's up to them and God's Spirit moving in them, whether they accept that light or reject it. But we can introduce people